Hello, everybody. I am going live to present my model of photon confinement. I want to caveat this by saying this theoretical model is a work in progress, and there's going to be some changes, some things that are not quite right, but overall, the general scope and scale and method, I think, is correct. But I mean, only time will tell. But it aligns with everything that we find in terms of magnetic alignment charge, the characteristics of particles, uh, the reason why we can't perceive of light until it interacts with something. Like all these things are answered within this model, and it doesn't require any kind of abstract thinking outside of the four dimensions um, of space, time, and there's more dimensions of energy, but so you have space and time are the four dimensions, and then all the dimensions of energy. And everybody keeps trying to say like there's these other dimensions that lie outside of our reality that somehow interact with reality, and maybe that could be, but the only things we can interact with are things that are in our reality. And that means that all the things that we know to be true have to be something we can interact with within reality. So I don't want to present any visual aids or anything like that. I kind of just want to talk about it first. See if I can get the intuition across without, well, maybe visualizations could be important, but regardless, let me just start with how, like, what the process of emergence was. So the way I think of our story, you could say, or like the series of events that unfolded, was that something initiated, you could say, an unfolding of the Big Bang, whatever it was. We're not quite sure yet. But the first thing that emerged was pure Planck energy and light. So everything was first light. And in order for it to begin to have any aspect of relativity, all of that light needed to interact in a way that created relativity. And then we ask, how did relative reality come to be? So that would be of space, of time, and of energy. Well, light has Planck length width, meaning that it's not of reality until it interacts with something that has another, at least Planck length width, so another photon or a particle in relative reality. So even though they exist as a, what would you say, as a measurement of Planck unit, so this photon is traveling or whatever, it's got Planck length width, which has no relative perspective for us, but if you get enough of these stacked on each other, it creates, you could say, space, an amalgamous space. But as they intersect and collide and manifest the particles that end up being relative, that's how we know it to currently be in physics as well. But the thing that we don't articulate is that these photons actually enter confinement, which is that they end up in an orbit with each other. And what's happening is at Planck length, they enter orbit, and what's happening is they create like a suction with each other in terms of they create a suction and they enter an orbit with each other. And you could say as they spread out in that orbit, and I haven't quite defined exactly the size of that it ends up being, but my current hypothesis is the reduced Compton wavelength. And that's the thing I've currently found to be likely the thing that aligns most. And the reason that we see, I could get into that later. So then you could say, well, like it's the easiest to start with electrons, even though I don't think that was a series of events that happened. I think electrons came after neutrons. So I guess I can start there. So photons collided with enough energy to create a trisphere, and there's three separate photon confined particles. But the confusing part is that they're all using the same space. So even though there's six photons confining these different particles, they're actually using the same space to do so. So they're stretching space and creating a vacuum there. So when the quarks, like you can say there's 6 photons that are all just combining into a confinement, and they stretch out space, and this is why they maintain neutral charge between all three. But the thing is that in order to maintain symmetry, they need something with all the opposite characteristics as well. So this is where an anti-neutron manifested. And so you have these two opposites that would cancel out into nothing, but the energy is still there. So this energy wants to be in something. And I mean, you could say like it doesn't have the actual desire. Maybe it does, but you could say like it's trying to permeate or trying to spread out, and like in doing so, it's manifesting all these particles. And first is neutrons, and obviously the universe had to cool. You could say cool, but be cool enough to where this vacuum energy and these particles actually could maintain coherence. So like you can say they started to form and they diverged, etc. It's like you could say it's constantly warping and coming in and out of existence. So breaking apart, coming back together, breaking apart, until eventually it cools enough to where it can maintain its identity. So then you have 3 quarks, each one with different characteristics, obviously, because nothing can have the perfectly same characteristics, even though the most things that are almost identical are the characteristics, say like spin 1/2 of a photon. Like that is as close to an absolute same across all photons. But the thing is there's always going to be a slight relativistic aspect to it, because we live in relative reality. But it may be that these things have perfect outside of our relative reality, have a perfect measurement of these things, or a perfect identity within that thing. So like h bar, which is Planck's constant. So it may be that h bar is something that can be defined perfectly outside of our relative reality, but it'll never be perfectly defined in our relative reality. We can only just say this is what it is. We're just going to assume that's accurate enough for us to just assume that that is what it is. So we'll never have a perfect, accurate measurement of Planck's constant or any of the constants. But what we can do is just assume it to be the case with more and more accuracy and just say, this is how we're defining it. And it's helpful and useful, but it's also, we need to acknowledge that those may likely change over time, depending on the characteristics of space, time, and energy as they unfold. And I know that sounds weird, but it's kind of to say if there's an area with less space, it necessitates less energy, and that would mean relatively it would have less time. So it's almost like it's moving through time faster. That's a better way to say it. So like as something loses energy, it moves through time faster, and that also necessitates that it has less space inside of it. So all 3 of these things always work in this relationship, but it's all relative. So it has to be a relationship with something else. So we have a relationship to the beginning of time because almost the beginning of time, because we can perceive of the relationship that emerged out of that perfect, you could say almost perfect specific point. But only when the relative particles manifested could we actually perceive of anything relative after the Big Bang happened. So the Big Bang happened first, relative particles emerged, and then we could start to perceive of them. So we couldn't perceive of them before the relative particles manifested. So it was just photons interacting. And so only through the creation of a relationship, when photons actually collide and create things and interact, can we actually perceive of any relative reality. And that might not be right. It might just be that photons themselves interacting at all can generate something in relative reality. They might not even need to generate particles, but that's something I have to think about for a little bit, and then ask some questions and research. But I know that the overall picture of photons coming together with enough force to manifest, obviously they'd have to manifest both particles. And this is how charge can come into being, and we get charge symmetry. But there's also helicity symmetry, meaning that there's always going to be the same amount. There's going to be the same amount of right-handed and left-handed photons in the universe. So helicity symmetry is a thing. Energy symmetry is a thing. So obviously we have, it's kind of a weird way to think of it actually, because energy is leaving our system and going somewhere, and for in terms of the whole universe, and that's because it's leaving our observable universe, and space is actually expanding faster. So it's possible that it's literally just a relationship, and it's reaching an equilibrium with something external, and that we have no access to. So we can't know that yet, and maybe we will figure it out. Maybe we won't. Maybe we're in a black hole. Maybe we're a series of events that spreads out that energy, and in spreading that out, the relative time in every space and everything changes, and maybe it happens again and again, kind of like Robert Penrose's aeons. But I'm digressing. I should make this more formal. But okay, so you have neutrons and antineutrons, and they have those characteristics. So they're creating a vacuum. That's what a gluon is. It's just the vacuum of these three particles actually separating, and it creates a vacuum in for them. They're like trying to pull back together back to where they were. So it's creating a vacuum of space, and if we create a circle, you could say around the center axes of these quarks, and you measure that in vacuum energy using the vacuum constant, then you'll find that it's very close, if not exact, to what the vacuum energy is. And maybe there's a little slight deviation because of the flux tubes that are going between each hadron, but those may just be you could just subtract those and be like, okay, those don't count towards the vacuum energy because that's how the quarks maintain relationship with each other, you could say. And so then you have that. Okay, so regardless, let me just finish the story. So you have neutrons and antineutrons, and they're connected together by the gluons, which is vacuum energy. But they're confined by the photons, which is preventing them from collapsing back in. And then you have antineutrons, and the antineutrons, for some reason or another, they decayed much more quickly into positrons and antiprotons. And obviously you also get an electron neutrino from this interaction. So you just calculate the number of total neutrons if you put all protons and electrons together into neutrons, and then added them to the total number of neutrons we expect there to be, or calculate there to be. And then you just say, okay, protons and electrons combine together to be protons or neutrons, and then you added it to the current number of neutrons, boom, you put them together, then we would know how many antineutrons there would need to be at the beginning of the universe. And then what you do from there is, so you would decay them into the antiproton and the positron, and then you would say, okay, from that you would set aside all the electron neutrinos that you would calculate from that interaction, from that decay, and then you would say, if both the positron and the antiproton annihilated with each other, how many electron neutrinos would we expect to get as a result of maintaining symmetry from that? And that's how we get all the electron neutrinos. So this is what I think is currently happening, and that if you just balanced out all the aspects besides the energy, for some reason there seems to be an excess energy in the universe, then everything else would just cancel out. And we're reaching equilibrium with something external. So maybe we are literally at the edge of the universe is the Hawking radiation that's being released from our black hole that we're in. Or maybe it's an aeon thing where it's just like the observable universe is the bubble, and then as you cycle this space, time, and energy, eventually everything reaches zero, or asymptotically approaches zero energy, zero space, zero time. Then boom, another Big Bang starts. So either way, I think it's cyclical, and I think it's a repeated thing that happens over and over again. And this is going to be the forefront of physics going forward, is figuring out exactly which one matches the patterns that we see in things that we observe. And a lot of these, and that's the thing, is the answers to the nature of the universe are in the patterns that we see around us in everything. And I know that sounds like more metaphysical and religious, but it's true. It's like you can see the patterns of emergence and of the things because of the characteristics of those underlying of the underlying universe. And then you ask, okay, well, what seems to be the nature of beings? And there's just so much to us and so much that we have to, like, there's an infinite number of things we have to discover about ourselves in the universe, and it will never end, and we'll always be pursuing it. So anyways, back to sorry, I keep digressing. So you have all the electron neutrinos, and then that's why we have matter over antimatter, because all of that was converted, all the antimatter, because it could have been matter, but I guess the universe kind of flipped a coin, decided to annihilate all the antimatter, is from our version what we call it, but really it's just opposite energy in every way. So it's opposite helicities, opposite charge. Everything about it is opposite, even though it's still energy. So it's not like there's this other world or something like that. It's kind of like if you waft your hand through the air, above your hand or below your hand, you'll have the air circulating in one vortice, and above it, it'll be circulating in the opposite vortice. And when these vortices connect, they dissipate again. So they cancel out each other's energy. And this is happening within every type of energy, with all space, with all time, it all cancels out. But the thing is there's a cycle of breathing, you could say, where things are going in and out and in and out. And that is exactly how our universe works as a whole. It's like a heartbeat almost. It's I know that's pattern recognition, but it's like this is what's happening is a constant. Or yeah, that's another aspect. It's like maybe there's a big crunch, right? That's the third possibility. So once you have all those, then everything else just starts to make sense, right? So you have neutrons, they'll decay into electrons and protons, and protons, neutrons, and electrons make atoms, and then atoms combine together to make molecules. So this is all you need to interpret all of our relative reality, like that structure, you could say. But then you could say, okay, well, what are these things called W bosons that seem to, exchange charge between particles? Well, what those are really is either two things. It's unconfined, so this means there's no photon confinement, unconfined energy in charge. But I don't think that's quite right, because there's something about it that's being exchanged about charge, which would have to do with photons. So I would think that this would be just a different orientation of photons within that particle that lead it to have a different set of characteristics. And whatever characteristics we calculate is likely due to those things. So maybe charge can be exchanged, and maybe it's just a flipping of certain poles within the atoms, or the electrons, depending on what's actually being changed. Because obviously you can have quarks that can change identity, electrons and protons, they can come back together to form neutrons again. So these things happening, what we're going to figure out is exactly, okay, what is it about an electron and the internal photons that are inside of it that change or affect the way that single quark within the proton, and what gives it back its charge. And it's likely just the the photons inside of it that are changing orientation. And so this would be changing its identity through an increase in helicity, a changing of the orientation of the photons inside of the particle that are rotating at light speed around inside of it. And so this is a quick introduction of the theory and the theoretical model. And I know there's going to be a lot of questions about it, and like I'm trying to answer them. and I know that right now I'm like at 0 people that are watching, but as I articulate this more and it becomes more understood, I already see the path that's going to happen as people are going to be looking back at these videos, maybe judging me, like whatever. But because I see the truth in it, and I see that it has at least a path to being true. And maybe I'm crazy, maybe I'm not, maybe I have some truth that nobody's ever articulated before, which I also think is crazy. And I'm trying to describe it as well as possible without sounding like too arrogant about it. But it's one of those things that when you know something to be true, like you don't even question it anymore. And there's something that puts you at ease about that. And it's kind of like if you articulate that you have 2 eyeballs, right? Like you don't need someone to confirm that. You don't need to like have I need to scientifically test this every day to make sure that I have 2 eyeballs. It's like I know it because through my experience of it and the patterns that I see, and um, it continues to produce reliable results. It continues to allow me to navigate the world. So there's so much evidence that I have 2 eyeballs that it's like I don't need anybody to tell me that I do. And yeah, but regardless, I think this truth may be anxiety provoking for a lot of people if it is true. And it's one of those things that you have to go through. You're going to grow as a person, understanding reality at a deeper level. And I just went through this process for the past few years, and it's like what people have been saying about ego death and all these other aspects of your mind going into a chaotic void where you just anxious and anxiety, and then eventually you find your grounding again. And that's what happens when you develop a new understanding of reality. It's like all the way to the bottom, you've redefined everything and the way your mind works, and then you're building yourself back up to understand reality through that lens. And some people can adopt terrible philosophies. Some people can adopt things that are basically more or less true to reality. And the less true the new adoption, the new you is to reality, the more permanent that change is going to affect you, or the more poorly that permanent change is going to affect you. And these changes are very permanent because it's basically a reconciliation with the things that you've done and the thing where you want to be, and your articulation of that thing. So this is the kind of stuff that happened as a result of my spiritual awakening. And basically what I think, like a lot of these terms are new and weird and foreign, but when I start to show I'm going to make a video today and I'm going to show the geometry and pictures of how this stuff works. And it's going to make so much intuitive sense because basically it's just, you just imagine 2 photons, like this is just an electron. So like maybe there's more inside of hadrons, which is hard to articulate. And this is why I chose electrons, as even though it wasn't necessarily part of the process of in the beginning of time, protons and electrons had to decay from neutrons first. Basically, electrons are the easiest because of their simplicity, because I know they're 2 photons and I know that they have certain helicity, and they're much easier to change, manipulate, and test in terms of this complex theory. And I mean, it's not really complex. It's more like it's simpler to do it on this because of the geometry is more simple. There we go. That's a better way to say it. Whereas the geometry of a hadron is very complex because you have to imagine there's 6 sets of photons, and each one of these particles is creating like a weird vortex of magnetic field that's difficult to perfectly like measure in a way that like the simple bar magnet would be for the electron. So, and yeah, I'm going to show this in the next video, and I just want to go live to kind of just get my first initial intuitions out there about how I got to this. And it's through these things I call synthesis tiers. But and like anybody who's been watching my videos, like what synthesis tiers are. And it's still in development. And right now I have photons at the bottom. They are the first synthesis of the universe. And the second one would be relative particles. So this would include all other quarks, leptons, etc. And then you have atoms from hadrons and electrons. So in my model, quarks are individual particles, but they're also not. It's really confusing because that's the hardest one to articulate. Like, are hadrons their own tier of synthesis? I don't think so. And right now I'm kind of working that out with myself, trying to figure out exactly what that means, because it's hard. It's like it's both. It's like there's three separate particles, but they're all united because they're all in the same space, but they're all confined separately. So they're unified yet separate. And it's almost like a trinity in and of itself. Like a hadron is a trinity where all three are unified, but they're three distinct particles. So you can't have any of them in isolation. So it's weird that hadrons take on this form of the first relative particles, and or neutrons specifically, I guess. But it's also of space, time, and energy, which are three distinct yet inseparable things. So it's almost like this pattern that has three separate yet inseparable aspects continues to repeat itself over and over again. So this is like the family triad, right? So you have man, woman, and child, and like you can't have any of these three absent the other. So like, like once you don't have any kids, you die. If you don't have a man, there's no one to have kids. And then if you don't have a woman, there's no one to have kids. So it's very interesting that like mother is the Holy Spirit, father is the Father, and son is the Son, or child, which is actually the original meaning in the Hebrew of son is children or child. Misha, get out of there. Okay. So, by the way, my dog is she just had a CCL tear, so I had to get her surgery, but she's doing a lot better. And yeah, so that's my first attempt at articulating this to the world, and it's just the intuitive side. So obviously there's mathematics going to be involved behind this. Sorry, I was about to sneeze. So there's mathematics involved. There's all this other stuff that in the experiments, observations, but it all seems to fit. So when you look at what emerges out of photon confinement, you'd expect there to be a rotating electric field, which would generate a magnetic field, and then the orientation of the electric field, either internally or externally, is going to generate charge. So if it's internally, that means and then the other one's externally would be positive charged, internally would be negatively charged, and they'd be attracted to each other. And the force of attraction would be directly proportional to Coulomb's law, which is how much that electric charge from each photon is oriented inwards or outwards. And that's why it would come in increments of the number of photons involved. And this is why it's likely that hadrons are only like an entire hadron might be just confined by two photons. And it's a possibility, and maybe it's the result of the way things manifest in that way. It's just going to be something that we're going to have to geometrically solve in terms of how that works in reality. Like, under what circumstances do three spheres resolve as a result of turbulence, you could say, and how much energy would it take? And it seems to be that's the reason why neutrons have the form that they have. So we'll figure that out, but one thing at a time, right? And this is very new. Like I've like started this theory like 2 weeks ago at most, and I've been writing nonstop trying to reconcile this, because I was thinking of charge and like how the photons would have to be oriented for that charge to manifest. And at first I was like, is it just warping of space? Like, is when the photons enter confinement and then blow up, is it just creating a vacuum inside? And that was my original idea of like negatively charged particles, and then positively charged ones would just be excess energy or excess space inside. But then I was like, but the warping of space is what generates its mass. So it can't be that. and or sorry, mass is, or they're both. It's a reciprocal relationship. So the mass is what derives the amount of space it's warping, but also the amount of space that it's warping is proportional to its mass. So it's like photons enter confinement, they blow up, and then as they gain more energy, they're actually like they're shrinking inside, which is causing a stretching of space, pulling it inward. So it's a weird relationship, and that's something I have to figure out too. Is like, why is it that when let's say you're increasing the twist, you're twisting these photons harder. Wow. Okay, I just thought of that. So this is another thing, is I think of a photon as a single twist. So if they were twisting harder, it would actually pull space in, which would make them be more massive. It would make those things rotate. Sorry. It would make the internal turbulence rotate faster, which would be the turbulence of space. So that's why, like, it's almost like a ballerina spinning. As she tightens up, it spins faster. So it could be that as you increase the energy of a particle, they twist, which is tightening up that space. So it twists harder. Wow, that's incredible. Okay, I need to actually write about that. Thank you guys for watching. I'm going to release that video soon. All right, bye. Love you guys.